The planet Thornus V was nothing more than a speck of dust on the galactic map, a desolate, barren world lost in the vastness of space, where the very air seemed to hum with despair. The sky, a perpetual shade of blood red, hung oppressively over the cracked earth, and the twin suns blazed mercilessly, turning the land into a furnace. It was a place where life was a rarity, and hope was an extinct species. It was here that Xenia found herself, sentenced to live out her days in the belly of a beast known as the Wastes, the high-security prison that consumed the planet's heart. Xenia was an anomaly in this hellish landscape. Her pale blue skin, now marred by bruises and scars, and her luminous, violet eyes, once full of curiosity and life, marked her as an outsider among the dregs of the galaxy. The prison's oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on her, both physically and mentally, but Xenia's spirit remained unbroken. She clung to a single truth that kept her from succumbing to the madness that had claimed so many others. She was innocent. The days in the Wastes bled into one another, indistinguishable and endless. The prison was a labyrinth of cold steel and flickering lights, designed not just to imprison the body but to shatter the mind. The walls were thick with the ghosts of those who had perished here, their memories etched into the very stone, their screams forever echoing in the corridors. Xenia moved through these corridors like a shadow, her every step measured, her every breath controlled. To show fear was to invite death. Her cell was a small, windowless box, barely large enough for her to stand in. The air inside was stale, and the only light came from a single, dim bulb that flickered erratically, casting twisted shadows on the walls. The cot she slept on was little more than a slab of metal, and the thin blanket offered no comfort against the chill that seeped into her bones. The guards, faceless figures clad in black armor, treated the prisoners with cold indifference, their eyes hidden behind reflective visors that turned them into soulless machines. They had no names, no identities, just tools of the system that had condemned her. Each morning Xenia was awakened by the harsh blare of the prison's sirens, a sound that clawed at her nerves like the talons of a ravenous beast. The guards would come, their heavy boots clanging on the metal floor, to drag her from her cell and march her to the workyards. There, under the blazing suns, she toiled alongside other prisoners, their alien bodies bent and broken under the weight of the tasks they were forced to endure. The work was backbreaking, designed to grind down even the strongest of spirits. But Xenia persevered, her hands blistered and bleeding, her muscles screaming in agony, driven by a single thought: survival. The other prisoners were a motley collection of beings from across the galaxy: thieves, murderers, deserters, and those like her, who had been swallowed by the system for crimes they didn't commit. They spoke in a cacophony of languages, their words a jumbled mess in the harsh wind that swept across the yard. Xenia understood little of their speech, but she had learned to read the language of the body, the clenched fists, the furtive glances, the way they hunched their shoulders to ward off the invisible blows that came from all sides. Trust was a commodity in short supply here, and Xenia was careful to keep to herself, avoiding the entanglements that could lead to her downfall. There was a hierarchy within the prison, a brutal pecking order that determined who lived and who died. At the top were the gang's factions of prisoners who had banded together for mutual protection and power. They controlled the contraband that flowed through the prison, from food and medicine to information and weapons. Their leaders were hard, ruthless beings who had clawed their way to the top through violence and manipulation. They ruled the prison with an iron fist, and those who opposed them were quickly dispatched, their bodies left as warnings to others. Xenia had no interest in the gangs or their power struggles. Her goal was simple: survive long enough to find a way out. But survival in the Wastes was a delicate balancing act. To be too strong was to invite challenge, to be too weak was to invite predation. Xenia walked a thin line, showing enough strength to deter the predators, but not so much that she became a target for the powerful. It was a precarious existence, one that required constant vigilance and an unyielding will. Despite her efforts to remain invisible, Xenia had caught the attention of the prison's warden Trell. Warden Trell was a hulking figure, his body encased in a battle-scarred exosuit that amplified his already considerable strength. His face, what little of it was visible beneath the suit's helmet, was a mass of scars, his eyes cold and pitiless. He ruled the Wastes with an iron hand, and his word was law. Trell had taken a particular interest in Xenia, and she could feel his gaze on her, watching, waiting for her to slip. "You don't belong here," he had said to her once, his voice a low growl that echoed through the empty yard. "But that won't save you. The Wastes consume all, and you're no different. You'll break, just like the others." Xenia had said nothing in response, meeting his gaze with a calm defiance that masked the turmoil beneath. She knew better than to show weakness, but she also knew that Trell's attention was a dangerous thing. The warden was a predator, and she was his prey. He would bide his time, waiting for the moment when she was weakest, and then he would strike. The days dragged on, each one more grueling than the last. Xenia's body, despite its alien resilience, began to wear down under the relentless strain. Her limbs ached, her head throbbed, and her vision sometimes blurred as dehydration and exhaustion took their toll. But it was the nights that were the worst. In the darkness of her cell, the silence was suffocating, and her thoughts became her enemies. She would lie on the cold, hard cot, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing as she replayed the events that had led her here. She had been a scientist, a researcher working on the frontier of her people's knowledge. Her work had been her life, her passion, and she had been on the brink of a discovery that could have changed everything. But then, without warning, her world had been turned upside down. She had been accused of sabotage, of betraying her people to an enemy that didn't exist. The trial had been a farce, a spectacle designed to appease the masses and cover up the real criminals. Before she could even process what was happening, she had been sentenced and shipped off to Thornus V, her life stolen from her in an instant. The memory of her arrest was a blur of confusion and terror. She had been in her lab, surrounded by her work, when they had come for her. The guards had stormed in, their weapons drawn, and she had been dragged away, her protests ignored. Her colleagues had looked on in shock, too afraid to intervene. She had seen the fear in their eyes, the realization that it could have been any of them. The trial had been swift, the verdict predetermined. Her innocence didn't matter. She had been a convenient scapegoat, and now she was paying the price. But Xenia refused to give up. She had survived this long, and she would continue to survive. She would endure the pain, the hunger, the fear, and she would find a way out of this nightmare. She would prove her innocence, no matter the cost. One night, as she lay in her cell, she overheard a conversation between two guards stationed just outside. They spoke in low voices, but the walls of the wastes were thin, and their words carried through the silence. "Heard there's a riot brewing," one of them said, his voice tinged with excitement. "The gangs are getting restless. Too many new faces, not enough supplies. It's only a matter of time before things boil over." "Yeah, well, let's hope it happens soon," the other replied. "I'm sick of this place. Maybe in the chaos, we can make a run for it. I've got a contact off-world. Says he can get us out of here, no questions asked." The first guard chuckled. "You're dreaming, man, but if it goes down, I'm right behind you. Better to die trying than rot away here." The conversation ended, and the guards moved on, their footsteps fading into the distance. But their words stayed with Xenia, echoing in her mind. A riot. It was the last thing she wanted, but it could also be her only chance. In the chaos, she might be able to slip away, unnoticed amid the carnage. It was a slim hope, but it was better than nothing. For the next few days, Xenia kept her eyes and ears open, listening for any signs of unrest. The tension in the air was palpable, the atmosphere charged with the anticipation of violence. The prisoners were on edge, their movements more aggressive, their tempers shorter. The guards, too, seemed more alert, their patrols more frequent, their hands never far from their weapons. Then, one scorching afternoon, as Xenia toiled in the yard, the tension snapped. It started with a shout, sharp, angry, and filled with rage. A prisoner lunged at a guard, his makeshift weapon gleaming in the sun. The guard went down, blood spraying across the dusty ground, and just like that, the yard erupted into chaos. Prisoners surged forward, attacking the guards with anything they could find: rocks, metal scraps, their bare fists. The guards fought back, their batons and shock rods cracking down on flesh and bone. The air was filled with the sounds of battle shouts, screams, the sickening thud of blows landing. The scent of blood and sweat filled Xenia's nostrils, making her stomach churn. She didn't hesitate. While the others were consumed by violence, Xenia slipped through the melee, her movements quick and precise. She kept to the edges, avoiding the worst of the fighting, her eyes scanning for an opening. She had studied the layout of the yard, memorized the guard rotations, and now that knowledge paid off. She moved with purpose, her heart pounding in her chest, adrenaline coursing through her veins. A group of prisoners crashed into the fence, their bodies slamming against the electrified barrier. The smell of burning flesh filled the air as they fell back, screaming in agony. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The fence shorted out, the lights flickering as the prison's power grid struggled to compensate. Xenia saw her chance. She darted forward, ducking under a flailing arm, and slipped through the gap in the fence. The moment she was clear, she broke into a run, her feet pounding against the hard ground. The suns blazed down on her, but she didn't stop, didn't look back. The screams and shouts of the riot faded into the background as she focused on one thing: escape. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs threatened to give out. The landscape around her was a blur of red rock and dust, the air dry and hot, each breath a struggle. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving, had to get as far from the wastes as possible. When she finally stopped, she was alone in the vast, empty desert. The prison was nowhere in sight, hidden behind the rolling dunes and rocky outcrops. Xenia collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion, her vision swimming. She had made it out, but she knew her ordeal was far from over. The desert stretched out before her, endless and unforgiving. The twin suns hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. She had no food, no water, no shelter. Her chances of survival were slim, but Xenia didn't care. She was free. And that was all that mattered. As she lay on the ground, her chest heaving, Xenia allowed herself a moment of rest. The cool breeze swept over her, ruffling her matted hair, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear. She felt hope. But as the suns dipped below the horizon, casting the world into darkness, that hope was tempered by the harsh reality of her situation. She was alone, on an alien planet, with no resources and no allies. The desert was a dangerous place, filled with predators both natural and unnatural. If she didn't find shelter soon, the cold of the night would do what the prison had failed to kill her. Xenia pushed herself to her feet, her body protesting with every movement. She scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of civilization, any indication that she wasn't as alone as she felt. But there was nothing, just endless desert, stretching out in all directions. She had no choice but to keep moving. One foot in front of the other, she trudged forward, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The night was coming fast, and with it, the temperature would plummet. She had to find shelter, had to find something, anything that would keep her alive. And so Xenia walked, her thoughts a jumble of fear and determination. She had escaped the prison, but her fight for survival was just beginning. And in the back of her mind, one thought burned brighter than the suns above: she would find a way to clear her name, to expose the truth, no matter the cost. As the darkness closed in around her, Xenia vanished into the night, a lone figure in an unforgiving world. But she was no longer a prisoner, she was a survivor, and she would not stop until she had reclaimed her life. But what now? The desert was vast, and Xenia had no idea where to go. She was an alien on a hostile world, a fugitive with no resources and no allies. The odds were stacked against her, but Xenia refused to give in to despair. She had survived the wastes, and she would survive this too. As she walked, the landscape around her began to change. The flat, cracked earth gave way to rolling dunes of sand, the wind picking up, sending grains of sand skittering across the ground. The temperature was dropping, the heat of the day fading as the suns dipped below the horizon. The sky darkened, the stars beginning to appear, their light cold and distant. Xenia pulled her tattered cloak tighter around her, the thin fabric doing little to ward off the chill. She had to find shelter, had to find something, anything that would keep her alive through the night. The desert was a dangerous place, filled with predators that thrived in the darkness. If she didn't find shelter soon, she would be easy prey. It was on the 5th day of her trek that Xenia finally spotted something on the horizon, a dark shape that stood out against the pale sand. At first she thought it was another mirage, a trick of the light and heat that had plagued her during the long days of walking. But as she drew closer, the shape solidified into something tangible, something real. A structure, half hidden by the dunes, rose from the desert floor. It was small, squat, and weathered by the elements, but it was clearly a building, an outpost of some kind, a relic of a long-forgotten presence on this barren world. Xenia's heart leaped in her chest, a surge of hope giving her the strength to quicken her pace. As she approached the outpost, she noticed the signs of life, a thin plume of smoke rising from a vent, the faint hum of machinery. This was no abandoned ruin, someone was living here, in the middle of this wasteland. Xenia's steps slowed, caution taking over as she considered the possibilities. Whoever was inside could be a friend, an ally, or a foe. She couldn't afford to be reckless. She circled the building, staying low to the ground, her eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The outpost was small, with a single entrance and a few small windows, all covered with thick shutters. The walls were made of a dull, metallic alloy, pockmarked with age and exposure to the harsh environment. It looked like it had been here for years, perhaps decades, a solitary sentinel in the middle of nowhere. Xenia took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay inside, and approached the door. It was a simple metal slab with a control panel on one side. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the panel, before pressing the button to signal her presence. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dimly lit interior. The first thing Xenia noticed was the cool air, a welcome relief from the blistering heat outside. She stepped inside cautiously, her senses on high alert, and the door slid shut behind her with a quiet thud. The room was small, cluttered with equipment and supplies, but it was clean and orderly, a stark contrast to the desolation outside. As she moved further into the room, Xenia caught sight of a figure hunched over a workstation, his back to her. The man was tall and thin, his shoulders slightly hunched as he worked intently on a piece of equipment. He didn't seem to notice her presence at first, his attention focused on the task at hand. Xenia's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight of him. He was human, a man in his mid-30s, with short, dark hair that was flecked with gray at the temples. His skin was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light, and he wore a simple jumpsuit, the kind favored by researchers and scientists. There was an air of quiet intensity about him, a focused energy that made her pause. She took another step forward, and this time the man noticed her. He straightened slowly, his head turning to look at her over his shoulder. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Xenia could see the surprise in his eyes, followed quickly by wariness. He was clearly not expecting company, especially not someone like her. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but with an edge of caution. His accent was clipped, precise, definitely not a local. Xenia hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She could feel the dryness in her throat, the exhaustion tugging at her limbs. But she had no choice but to speak. "My name is Xenia," she said, her voice raspy from the days of dehydration. I'm not from here." The man studied her for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her disheveled appearance, the tattered cloak, the exhaustion written on her face. He didn't reach for a weapon, didn't make any sudden movements, but there was a tension in his posture that told her he was ready to defend himself if necessary. "Not from here," he repeated, his tone neutral. "You're an alien." It wasn't a question, more a statement of fact. Xenia nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to the small satchel at her side, where she had stashed the few remaining supplies she had left. "I escaped from a prison," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't commit the crime they accused me of. I just want to survive." The man's expression softened slightly, the wariness in his eyes giving way to something else, curiosity, perhaps, or even sympathy. He turned fully to face her, taking a step closer but still keeping a respectful distance. "A prison," he repeated thoughtfully. "That would be the wastes, I assume. You're a long way from there." Xenia nodded again, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. "I've been walking for days," she said. "I didn't know where else to go." The man's gaze softened further, and he seemed to come to a decision. He stepped forward, extending a hand toward her. "My name is Dr. Evan Carter," he said. "I'm a researcher stationed here, studying the planet's ecosystem. You look like you're about to collapse. Let me help you." Xenia hesitated for only a moment before taking his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, and he guided her to a nearby chair. As soon as she sat down, the world tilted slightly, her vision blurring as the exhaustion hit her full force. Evan moved quickly, retrieving a canister of water and handing it to her. "Drink slowly," he advised, his tone gentle but firm. "You're dehydrated. Too much at once could make you sick." Xenia nodded weakly, taking small sips from the canister. The water was cool and refreshing, and she could feel it reviving her, albeit slowly. She closed her eyes for a moment, focusing on her breathing, trying to steady herself. Evan watched her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You're lucky you found this place," he said quietly. "The desert isn't kind to travelers, especially those without proper supplies. You could have died out there." "I know," Xenia replied, her voice a little stronger now. But I had no choice. I couldn't stay in that prison. Evan nodded, understanding in his eyes. You don't need to explain, he said. I've heard about the conditions in the wastes. It's a miracle you made it out at all. They lapsed into silence for a moment, the only sound the soft hum of the outpost's machinery. Xenia continued to sip the water, feeling it slowly restore her strength. Evan seemed content to let her recover in silence, but she could see the questions in his eyes, the curiosity that was barely held in check. After a while, Xenia set the canister down and looked up at him. Why are you here, she asked, her voice still hoarse. This planet, it doesn't seem like the kind of place people would want to live. Evan chuckled softly, the sound almost bitter. I didn't choose this assignment, he said. I was sent here by the Galactic Research Institute. They needed someone to study the unique ecosystem of Thornus V, what little there is of it. It's not exactly a popular post, but I've made do. Xenia frowned, trying to process his words. What kind of research? Evan's expression turned thoughtful. This planet may look barren, but it's home to some of the most resilient life forms in the galaxy, he explained. There are microorganisms in the sand that can survive in extreme conditions, high temperatures, low moisture, radiation. The Institute is interested in studying these organisms, possibly for use in terraforming or medical applications. Xenia listened intently, her curiosity piqued despite her exhaustion. And you've been here alone? Evan nodded. For the most part. I get supply drops every few months, and occasionally someone from the Institute will visit to check on my progress. But other than that, it's just me in the desert. Xenia couldn't imagine such a life so isolated, so cut off from everything. And yet, as she looked at Evan, she could see a certain contentment in his expression, a quiet acceptance of his circumstances. It wasn't happiness, exactly, but a kind of peace that came from knowing one's place in the universe. I didn't expect to find anyone out here, Xenia admitted, her voice soft. I thought I might die before I found help. Evan's gaze softened, and he gave her a small, reassuring smile. You're safe now, he said. You can stay here for as long as you need to recover. I'll do what I can to help you. Xenia felt a wave of relief wash over her, the tension in her body easing slightly. She'd been running for so long, fighting for every breath, every step, and now, finally, she could rest. The relief was almost overwhelming, and she had to blink back tears of gratitude. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to repay you. Evan shook his head, his expression gentle. You don't have to, he replied. But I would like to hear your story when you're ready. Xenia hesitated. The memories of her ordeal still raw, still painful. But there was something about Evan, something kind and understanding that made her want to trust him, to share her burden. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts, and then began to speak. She told him about her life before the wastes, about her work as a scientist, and the discovery that had led to her downfall. She spoke of the arrest, the trial, and the sentence that had condemned her to a life in the high-security prison. She recounted the harsh conditions, the constant threat of violence, and the moment when the riot had given her the chance to escape. And finally, she described her harrowing journey through the desert, the fear and desperation that had driven her to keep going, even when her body had been ready to give up. Evan listened in silence, his expression growing more serious as she spoke. He didn't interrupt, didn't press her for details, but simply let her tell her story in her own time. When she finished, there was a long pause, the air heavy with the weight of her words. You've been through hell, Evan said quietly, his voice filled with a deep, quiet sympathy. I can't imagine what it must have been like. Xenia shook her head, her eyes downcast. I just want to clear my name, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I want to prove that I didn't do what they accused me of, but I don't know how. Evan was silent for a moment, his gaze distant as he considered her words. Then he looked back at her, his expression resolute. I'll help you, he said firmly. We'll find a way to prove your innocence. Xenia looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. Why would you do that, she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. You don't even know me. Evan's gaze softened, and he gave her a small, reassuring smile. I believe in justice, he said simply, and I believe that everyone deserves a fair chance. You've been wronged, and if I can help set that right, then I will. Xenia felt a lump form in her throat, a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real, tangible hope. She had been alone for so long, fighting against forces beyond her control, but now, finally, she had an ally. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say." Evan shook his head, his expression kind. "You don't need to say anything," he replied. "Just rest for now. We'll figure out the next steps together." Xenia nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and gratitude. She had found a friend in this desolate place, someone who was willing to help her when she had nothing left to give. It was more than she had dared to hope for. As she settled back into the chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her, Xenia allowed herself to relax, to trust in Evan's kindness. For the first time since her escape, she felt safe, truly safe, and it was a feeling she would hold on to with all her strength. Evan moved to a nearby terminal, his fingers dancing over the controls as he began to pull up information. Xenia watched him for a moment, her eyes growing heavy with fatigue. She knew there was still a long road ahead, that the fight to clear her name was far from over, but for now she allowed herself to rest, to take comfort in the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. As sleep began to claim her, Xenia's last thoughts were of the future, of the challenges that lay ahead, and of the man who had given her a glimmer of hope in the darkest of times. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: she was ready to face it, with Evan by her side. And with that thought, Xenia finally allowed herself to drift into a deep, dreamless sleep, the weight of her journey lifting from her shoulders, if only for a little while. The outpost became Xenia's sanctuary, a refuge from the relentless desert and the constant threat of discovery. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could sleep without fear of being hunted, eat without worrying where her next meal would come from, and breathe without the oppressive weight of the wastes pressing down on her chest. But as the days passed, Xenia knew that this fragile peace couldn't last forever. Thornus V was still a hostile world, and her enemies were likely already on her trail. She couldn't afford to stay hidden in the outpost indefinitely. She had to prepare for survival, for escape, and for the fight to clear her name. Evan Carter, the human researcher who had taken her in, proved to be a patient and thoughtful companion. Despite the obvious differences between them, a bond of mutual respect and understanding quickly formed. Evan had spent years studying the harsh environment of Thornus V, and he was eager to share his knowledge with Xenia, knowing it could mean the difference between life and death. It was early morning when Evan and Xenia ventured out of the outpost together for the first time. The twin suns were just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the dunes and bathing the desert in a pale, golden light. The air was still cool, a brief respite before the heat of the day set in. Xenia was dressed in a lightweight, protective suit that Evan had modified for her, its fabric designed to shield her from the worst of the sun's rays and to conserve moisture. Her boots crunched against the sand as she followed Evan across the uneven terrain, her senses on high alert. "Thornus V is a harsh place," Evan said as they walked, his voice calm and steady. "But it's also full of life, if you know where to look. The key to surviving here is understanding the environment, learning how to find water, food, and shelter in a landscape that offers very little." Xenia nodded, listening intently. She had seen the barrenness of the desert firsthand, felt its merciless grip on her body and mind. But if there was one thing she had learned in her time on this planet, it was that survival depended on adaptation, on finding ways to thrive even in the most inhospitable conditions. Evan led her to a rocky outcrop that jutted out of the sand, its surface pitted and scarred by the elements. He knelt down and gestured for Xenia to do the same. "See these cracks," he said, pointing to a series of narrow fissures in the rock. "This is where water collects after the rare rainstorms that pass through here. It's not much, but it's enough to sustain life if you know where to look." Xenia peered into the cracks, noticing the faint glimmer of moisture deep within. It was barely a few drops, but in the desert, even that was precious. She reached out and ran her fingers along the edge of the rock, feeling the coolness of the damp stone beneath her skin. It was a small but significant discovery, proof that even in this desolate place, life could find a way. "Is there enough to drink?" Xenia asked, her voice hushed as if speaking too loudly might cause the precious moisture to vanish. Evan shook his head. "Not directly. But there are plants and small animals that rely on these water sources to survive. If you know how to find them, you can harvest enough water to sustain yourself. It's a delicate balance, but it's possible. He stood up and began to scan the area. His eyes narrowed against the glare of the rising suns. "There's another spot nearby where we might find something more substantial," he said. "Come on, I'll show you." They walked for what felt like hours, the heat of the day gradually building as the suns climbed higher in the sky. The desert was a study in extremes, blindingly bright under the sun's gaze, with the sand reflecting the light like a sea of molten gold. The air grew dry and thin, each breath a challenge as the temperature continued to rise. Xenia's suit kept most of the heat at bay, but she could still feel the oppressive warmth seeping through, making her skin prickle with sweat. Despite the discomfort, Xenia kept pace with Evan, determined to absorb as much of his knowledge as she could. They reached another outcrop, this one larger and more jagged than the first. Evan crouched down again, his fingers tracing the contours of the rock as he searched for signs of life. After a few moments, he pointed to a small, spindly plant growing in the shade of the outcrop. Its leaves were thick and waxy, coated in a fine layer of dust. "This is a vellum succulent," Evan explained, carefully breaking off one of the leaves. "It's one of the few plants that can survive out here. The leaves store water, which you can extract if you know how." He handed the leaf to Xenia, showing her how to slice it open with the edge of her knife. A small trickle of clear liquid seeped out, and Xenia carefully collected it in a container. It wasn't much, just a few drops, but it was enough to sustain her for a little while longer. "There are other plants like this," Evan continued, "but they're rare and often well hidden. The key is to know where to look and to take only what you need. If you strip a plant completely, it won't survive, and neither will you." Xenia nodded, understanding the delicate balance that existed in this harsh environment. Every drop of water, every morsel of food was precious, and survival depended on a deep respect for the fragile ecosystem. As they continued their exploration, Evan taught Xenia how to identify edible plants and locate the burrows of small creatures that could be hunted for food. He showed her how to use the tools at her disposal to maximize her chances of finding sustenance in the desert. Xenia listened carefully, her mind absorbing every detail, every piece of advice that might help her survive if she were ever on her own again. But it wasn't just the physical aspects of survival that Evan focused on. He also spoke of the mental resilience needed to endure the isolation and harshness of Thornus V. "The desert can break you if you let it," he said as they rested in the shade of a large rock. "It's not just the lack of food or water, it's the silence, the endlessness, the feeling of being utterly alone. You have to find something to hold on to, something that keeps you going even when it feels like the world is closing in around you." Xenia understood this all too well. She had felt the crushing weight of the desert's emptiness, the way it seemed to stretch on forever with no end in sight. It was easy to lose hope, to give in to the despair that whispered in the back of her mind. But she also knew that she couldn't afford to give up. She had come too far, survived too much, to let the desert claim her now. "I have something to hold on to," Xenia said quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I want to clear my name, to prove that I'm not guilty of the crimes they accused me of. I want to expose the corruption that put me in that prison in the first place." Evan looked at her, his expression serious. "That's a powerful motivator," he said, "and it's something worth fighting for. But you'll need more than just determination. You'll need allies, resources, and a plan." Xenia nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "I know. But first I need to survive. I need to get off this planet." Evan was silent for a moment, his gaze distant as he considered her words. "There might be a way," he said finally. "But it won't be easy, and it won't be without risks." Xenia turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Evan took a deep breath before speaking. "There's an old communications array located about a day's journey from here, in the mountains to the north. It was abandoned years ago, but it might still be operational at least partially. If we can reach it and send a signal, we might be able to contact someone off-world who can help you. But the array is in a dangerous area, and the journey will be difficult." Xenia felt a surge of hope at his words, but it was tempered by the reality of the situation. Dangerous, how she asked, her voice steady but laced with caution. "There are creatures that live in the mountains," Evan explained. "Predators that hunt anything that enters their territory. They're fast, intelligent, and ruthless. And then there's the weather, sandstorms, extreme temperature shifts, and the risk of rock slides. It's not a journey to be taken lightly." Xenia considered his words carefully, weighing the risks against the potential reward. The thought of facing more dangers was daunting, but the possibility of contacting someone who could help her was too tempting to ignore. She had to take the chance. "I'm willing to try," she said firmly. "If there's even a small chance that we can get a signal out, it's worth the risk." Evan nodded, respect glinting in his eyes. "I thought you might say that. We'll need to prepare, carefully gather supplies, study the terrain, and plan our route. We can't afford to make any mistakes." They spent the next several days in intense preparation. Evan taught Senya everything he knew about the mountains and the dangers they would face. They studied maps, analyzed weather patterns, and carefully rationed their supplies. Every decision was made with precision, every step planned out in meticulous detail. Xenia knew that their survival depended on it. During this time, Xenia and Evan grew closer, their bond deepening as they worked together toward a common goal. They shared stories of their pasts, of the lives they had left behind and the dreams they still held on to. Xenia found herself opening up to Evan in ways she hadn't expected, sharing her fears and doubts, her hopes and ambitions. And in return, Evan spoke of his own struggles, the isolation he had faced on Thornus V, the sense of purpose he had found in his research, and the quiet loneliness that had settled in over the years. As they worked side by side, a quiet understanding grew between them, a recognition of the strength each of them possessed, the resilience that had brought them both to this point. They were different in many ways, but in this harsh, unforgiving world they had found something in each other that gave them both hope. Finally, the day came when they were ready to set out. The suns had barely risen when Xenia and Evan left the safety of the outpost, their packs loaded with supplies, their minds focused on the journey ahead. The desert stretched out before them, vast and empty, but they faced it with a sense of purpose that made the endless expanse seem less daunting. As they walked, Xenia felt a sense of determination settle over her. She had survived the prison, the desert, and the isolation of this barren world. She had found an ally in Evan, someone who believed in her and was willing to help her fight for justice. And now she had a plan, a way to reach out to the stars and find the help she needed. The journey to the mountains was grueling, the heat of the day sapping their strength as they trekked across the dunes. The terrain grew more challenging as they neared the mountains, the sand giving way to rocky outcrops and jagged cliffs. But Xenia pushed on, her body fueled by the knowledge that every step brought her closer to her goal. Evan was a steady presence by her side, guiding her through the rough terrain, his knowledge of the planet's ecosystem proving invaluable. He pointed out potential hazards, led her to hidden water sources, and helped her navigate the treacherous landscape. Xenia was grateful for his expertise, knowing that without him, she might never have made it this far. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner, colder. The wind whipped around them, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. The weather was changing, and they both knew that a storm was coming. They needed to reach the communications array before it hit, or risk being caught in the open, vulnerable to the elements and the predators that roamed the area. By the time they reached the base of the array, the sky had darkened, the suns hidden behind thick clouds that threatened to unleash a deluge. The array was a massive structure, its rusted metal framework rising high above them, partially obscured by the encroaching sand. It was clear that the array had been abandoned for years, its once gleaming surface now pitted and worn by the relentless forces of nature. Evan led the way to the control room, a small building at the base of the array, its entrance half buried by sand. He pried open the door, and they stepped inside, the air cool and musty, tinged with the scent of rust and decay. The control room was a mess of wires, consoles, and machinery, much of it covered in dust and sand. But Evan was undeterred, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced gaze. "This is it," he said, his voice calm but determined. "If we can get the power back on and the signal booster working, we might be able to send a message. It won't be easy, and there's no guarantee it will work, but it's our best shot." Xenia nodded, her heart racing with anticipation. "What do you need me to do?" Evan gave her a quick, reassuring smile. "There's a backup generator in the next room. It hasn't been used in years, but if we're lucky, we might be able to get it running. I'll work on the signal booster while you try to start the generator. If we can get the systems online, we'll have a chance." Xenia wasted no time, moving to the next room where the generator was located. It was an old, bulky machine covered in dust and grime, its control panel flickering weakly. Xenia took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the controls. She had never worked with this kind of equipment before, but Evan had given her a crash course during their preparations, and she was determined to make it work. She flipped the switches, her fingers moving carefully over the controls, listening to the generator as it sputtered and groaned. For a moment she feared it was too far gone, that the years of neglect had rendered it useless. But then, with a loud rumble, the generator roared to life, the lights in the control room flickering on as power surged through the array. Evan's voice came over the calm but laced with excitement. "Great work, Xenia. The signal booster is coming online. I'm running diagnostics now to see if we can establish a connection." Xenia returned to the control room, her heart pounding as she joined Evan at the console. The screens flickered with static, the machinery humming with newfound life. Evan's fingers flew over the controls, his eyes focused on the data scrolling across the screen. Come on," he muttered under his breath, his tone tense with concentration. Xenia watched, her breath catching in her throat as the static slowly cleared, replaced by a faint, pulsing signal. It was weak, barely detectable, but it was there, a connection to the outside world, a lifeline in the darkness. Evan looked up at her, his expression a mixture of relief and determination. "We've got a signal," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "It's weak, but it's there. We might be able to send a message, but we'll need to keep it short. The storm is coming, and the signal could cut out at any moment." Xenia nodded, her mind racing as she considered what to say. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance, to reach out, to find help, to clear her name. She had to make it count. Taking a deep breath, Xenia leaned over the console, her fingers trembling as she began to type. She kept the message short, concise, her words chosen carefully. She identified herself, explained her situation, and asked for help, anything that could prove her innocence or expose the corruption that had led to her imprisonment. She included the coordinates of the array, hoping that whoever received the message would be able to trace it back to her. As she typed the final words, the ground beneath them trembled, a low rumble echoing through the mountains. The storm was closing in, and the wind howled outside, rattling the walls of the control room. "Send it now," Evan urged, his voice tight with urgency. Xenia hit the send button, her heart pounding in her chest as the message was transmitted. The screen flashed, confirming that the message had been sent, but there was no way to know if it had been received. For a long moment they stood in silence, the hum of the machinery the only sound in the room. The storm raged outside, the wind screaming as it tore through the mountains, but inside the control room, the air was thick with anticipation. Finally, Evan let out a slow breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. "It's done," he said quietly. "Now we wait and hope someone out there is listening." Xenia nodded, her emotions a whirlwind of hope, fear, and determination. She had taken a huge risk, but it was a risk she had been willing to take. The message was out there, floating through the void of space, a plea for help from a distant, barren world. But as the storm intensified outside, the reality of their situation settled over them. They were still on Thornus V, still facing the dangers of the desert and the enemies who might be hunting them. The message was only the first step. There was still so much that could go wrong. Evan moved to the window, his gaze fixed on the dark clouds swirling overhead. "We need to take shelter," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The storm is going to get worse before it gets better. We can ride it out here, but we need to be prepared." Xenia joined him at the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. The storm was a wall of darkness, swallowing the landscape and blotting out the light. The wind howled, and the ground trembled beneath their feet, but inside the control room, they were safe for now. Evan began to secure the room, closing the shutters and reinforcing the door, while Xenia checked their supplies, making sure they had enough to last through the storm. The atmosphere was tense, but there was also a sense of determination, a recognition that they had come this far, and they would see it through to the end. As the storm raged on, Xenia and Evan sat together in the control room, their backs against the cold metal walls, listening to the wind howl outside. The hours passed in a blur of noise and darkness, but they kept each other company, sharing stories and thoughts to pass the time. In the quiet moments between the howls of the storm, Xenia found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The storm that raged around the old communications array was like nothing Xenia had ever experienced. The winds howled with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountains, and the air was thick with sand and dust, whipped into a frenzy by the storm's unrelenting power. The sky, Once a clear expanse of pale blue, was now a churning mass of dark clouds, lightning flashing intermittently as thunder rumbled ominously in the distance. Inside the control room, Xenia and Evan huddled together, waiting for the tempest to pass, the noise outside almost deafening in its intensity. For hours, the storm showed no signs of relenting. The walls of the control room trembled under the force of the wind, and the metal shutters rattled loudly, threatening to break loose at any moment. The small, dimly lit room felt like a fragile refuge against the chaos outside, the machinery and equipment trembling in sympathy with the violence of the storm. Xenia could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on them, a palpable reminder of the dangers they faced on this hostile planet. But despite the ferocity of the storm, Xenia's thoughts were focused elsewhere on the message they had sent out into the void and on the uncertain future that lay ahead. There was no way to know if the message had been received or if help would come. The uncertainty gnawed at her, a persistent anxiety that she struggled to push aside. "We did everything we could," Evan said quietly, as if sensing her unease. He was sitting beside her on the cold metal floor, his back against the wall. His voice was calm, reassuring, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his tone. "Now, it's just a matter of waiting and seeing what happens." Xenia nodded, her eyes distant as she stared at the flickering lights of the control panels. "I know," she replied softly, "but waiting is the hardest part." Evan smiled faintly, a weary expression that mirrored her own. It always is. The hours dragged on, the storm outside showing no sign of abating. Xenia tried to distract herself by engaging in conversation with Evan, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the message and the dangers that still awaited them. She knew that they couldn't stay in the control room forever. The storm would pass eventually, and when it did, they would need to move quickly. Thornus V was not a planet that allowed for complacency, and Xenia was all too aware that their enemies could be closing in even now. As the storm finally began to subside, the winds dying down to a dull roar and the sand settling back to the ground, Xenia felt a sense of foreboding settle over her. The air was thick with tension, and the silence that followed the storm was almost oppressive in its intensity. Evan, too, seemed to sense it, his expression growing more serious as he surveyed the room. "We need to be ready to leave as soon as the storm clears completely," Evan said, his voice low. "If the signal got through, we might have help on the way. But if it didn't, well, we need to be prepared for that, too." Xenia nodded, her mind already racing with the possibilities. "Do you think they'll come for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evan's gaze was steady, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "It's possible," he replied. "The bounty hunters, the prison authorities, they won't give up easily. But we've got a head start, and we know the terrain better than they do. We just have to stay one step ahead." Xenia took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She had faced danger before, escaped from a high-security prison, survived the harsh desert, and sent a message into the void with nothing more than a hope and a prayer. But now, as she prepared to face whatever pursuit awaited them, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. They spent the next few hours preparing to leave, gathering their supplies and checking their equipment. Evan took a moment to examine the old maps of the surrounding area, plotting out potential escape routes and identifying places where they could take shelter if necessary. Xenia helped where she could, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she packed their gear and secured their provisions. By the time the storm had fully passed, they were ready. The sky outside was a deep, bruised purple, the remnants of the storm clouds lingering on the horizon as the twin suns began their slow descent toward the horizon. The air was cool, almost cold, a welcome relief from the heat that had plagued them earlier. But the sense of foreboding remained, a constant, gnawing presence at the back of Xenia's mind. As they stepped out of the control room and into the open air, Xenia was struck by the eerie stillness that had settled over the mountains. The landscape, once so violent and chaotic, was now eerily quiet, the only sound the soft crunch of their boots against the sand and rock. The storm had left its mark on the land, deep gouges in the earth, broken rocks, and scattered debris, but there was no sign of life, no indication that anyone else was nearby. But Xenia knew better than to let her guard down. The calm after the storm was often the most dangerous time, when the predators of Thornus V emerged from their hiding places to hunt. She and Evan moved quickly, their senses on high alert as they made their way down the mountain path, the array growing smaller behind them with each step. The plan was simple: reach the next outpost before nightfall, take shelter, and then assess their situation. They had identified a small research station about a half-day's journey away, one that Evan believed would be abandoned but still intact. If they could reach it, they would have a chance to regroup, to plan their next move. But the journey would be treacherous, especially with the possibility of pursuit hanging over their heads. As they descended into the valley below, Xenia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was a prickling sensation at the back of her neck, a sense of unease that made her skin crawl. She glanced over at Evan, who was walking slightly ahead of her, his eyes scanning the terrain with practiced precision. He, too, seemed tense, his movements more cautious, his gaze flicking from side to side as if expecting an ambush. They continued in silence for a time, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as the night approached. Xenia wrapped her cloak tighter around her, her breath visible in the chilly air. The silence was oppressive, the landscape devoid of life, and the tension between them was palpable. It was just as they reached the bottom of the valley that the first sign of trouble appeared. A low, rumbling growl echoed through the air, reverberating off the rocky walls of the valley. Xenia froze, her heart pounding in her chest, as she tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was close, too close, and it sent a jolt of fear through her body. Evan reacted immediately, his hand going to the weapon at his side. "We need to move," he said urgently, his voice low but firm. "Now." Xenia didn't need to be told twice. She turned and followed Evan as he broke into a run, her feet pounding against the uneven ground as they raced toward the narrow pass that led out of the valley. The growling grew louder, closer, and Xenia could hear the sound of something massive moving through the shadows, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. They barely made it to the pass before the creature emerged from the darkness behind them, a massive, hulking beast with thick, leathery skin and eyes that gleamed like embers in the fading light. It was unlike anything Xenia had ever seen, a predator perfectly adapted to the harsh environment of Thornus V. Its jaws snapped open, revealing rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth, and it let out a deafening roar that shook the very ground beneath them. Evan didn't hesitate. He pulled his weapon, a compact energy rifle, from its holster and fired a series of rapid shots at the creature. The energy bolts struck the beast's thick hide, but it barely seemed to notice, shaking off the attacks as if they were nothing more than insect bites. It charged toward them, its massive body barreling through the narrow pass with terrifying speed. "Run," Evan shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Xenia didn't argue. She turned and sprinted up the pass, her heart racing as the sound of the creature's pursuit echoed behind her. The path was narrow and treacherous, the ground uneven and slick with sand, but she didn't dare slow down. She could hear the creature gaining on them, its growls growing louder, more frenzied. Evan fired another shot over his shoulder as he ran, but it only seemed to enrage the beast further. It let out another roar, the sound reverberating through the valley, and Xenia felt a surge of adrenaline course through her veins. She pushed herself to run faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fought to stay ahead of the creature. The pass opened up into a wider canyon, the walls towering high above them, and Xenia knew they had to find a way out quickly. The creature was too large to maneuver easily in the narrow pass, but in the open canyon, it would have the advantage. They needed to find shelter, a place to hide or defend themselves, before it was too late. There, Evan shouted, pointing to a narrow crevice in the canyon wall. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it offered a potential escape route, a chance to lose the creature in the maze of rocky tunnels. Xenia didn't hesitate. She veered toward the crevice, her body aching from the exertion, but she forced herself to keep moving. She reached the entrance and scrambled inside, the rough stone scraping against her skin as she squeezed through the narrow gap. Evan was right behind her, his breath hot on her neck as he followed her into the darkness. The creature roared in frustration, its massive body too large to follow them into the crevice. Xenia could hear it thrashing outside, its growls echoing through the tunnels as it tried to reach them. The ground trembled with the force of its rage, and Xenia felt a surge of relief that they had managed to escape, at least for now. They continued to move through the tunnels, their path illuminated only by the faint light filtering in from above. The air was cool and damp, the walls slick with moisture. The sound of the creature's roars gradually faded as they put more distance between themselves and the canyon, the darkness swallowing them up as they ventured deeper into the maze of tunnels. Finally, after what felt like hours, they emerged into a small cavern, the walls smooth and rounded, the ceiling high above them. The ground was littered with rocks and debris, but it was relatively flat, offering a place to rest. Xenia collapsed against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Evan sank down beside her, his face pale and drawn, his hands shaking as he set down his weapon. For a long moment they sat in silence, the only sound the faint drip of water somewhere in the cavern. Xenia's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, relief that they had escaped, fear of what lay ahead, and the lingering adrenaline that kept her on edge. "That was too close," Evan said, finally, his voice hoarse. He looked at Xenia, his expression grim. "We can't keep running like this. We need to find a place to make a stand, or we'll be hunted down one by one." Xenia nodded, her thoughts still racing. "We need to reach the outpost," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "If we can get there, we might be able to fortify it, set up defenses. It's our best chance." Evan set his pack down on the table and began to check the equipment, while Xenia moved to the window, her eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of movement. The rain was falling steadily now, the sky a dark, roiling mass of clouds. The wind howled through the narrow pass, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the distant rumble of thunder. "We need to secure the door," Evan said, his voice tense. "If they're tracking us, this might be our last chance to prepare." Xenia nodded, moving to help him barricade the entrance. They used the broken equipment and pieces of furniture to reinforce the door, stacking them high and wedging them into place. It wasn't much, but it would slow down anyone trying to break in. Once the door was secured, they turned their attention to the rest of the outpost, checking the windows and sealing any gaps that might allow the wind or rain to enter. The room was cold and damp, but it was safe, and that was all that mattered. As they worked, Xenia couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The storm outside was growing more intense, the wind howling and the rain lashing against the walls of the outpost. But it wasn't just the weather that made her uneasy, it was the sense that they were being watched, that their enemies were closing in. "We should take turns keeping watch," Evan said, his voice low as they finished securing the room. "We can't afford to let our guard down." Xenia agreed, her mind already racing with the possibilities. "I'll take the first watch," she offered. "You should get some rest." Evan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right," he said, his expression serious. "Wake me if anything happens." He moved to the corner of the room, where he set up a makeshift bed using the blankets and supplies they had brought with them. Xenia watched as he lay down, his body tense, his eyes closed but his mind clearly still alert. She took up her position by the window, her eyes scanning the dark landscape outside. The rain was falling heavily now, the sky a dark, churning mass of clouds. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the distant rumble of thunder. Xenia's thoughts drifted as she kept watch, her mind filled with memories of her journey of the prison she had escaped from, the desert she had crossed, and the danger she had faced along the way. She had come so far, survived so much, but the fight was far from over. She knew that their enemies were out there, somewhere, and that they wouldn't stop until they had her in their grasp. But Xenia wasn't afraid. She had faced danger before, and she would face it again. She had found strength in herself that she hadn't known she possessed, and she had found an ally in Evan, someone who believed in her and was willing to fight by her side. The night passed slowly, the storm outside raging on, but Xenia remained vigilant, her eyes never leaving the dark landscape beyond the window. She was ready for whatever came next, ready to fight for her freedom, her life, and her future. As the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds, the storm finally started to subside, the wind dying down to a gentle breeze, and the rain easing to a soft drizzle. Xenia felt a sense of relief wash over her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the real danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows. She turned to wake Evan, her heart heavy with the weight of the challenges that still lay ahead. They had survived another day, but the fight was far from over. And Xenia knew, deep in her heart, that the hardest battles were yet to come. The first rays of dawn filtered through the narrow window, casting a faint light across the small, fortified outpost. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world transformed by its fury. The rain-soaked landscape glistened in the early morning light, the once parched earth now saturated with moisture, the air crisp and cool. Xenia watched as the last remnants of the storm clouds drifted away, revealing a sky that was gradually turning from dark gray to a soft, muted blue. She had kept watch throughout the night, her mind sharp despite the fatigue that gnawed at her. Every sound, every movement outside the outpost had been analyzed, assessed for potential danger. But the storm had kept most threats at bay, and the night had passed without incident. Now, as the day began, Xenia knew it was time to wake Evan and prepare for whatever lay ahead. She turned away from the window and moved to where Evan lay, still wrapped in the blankets they had brought with them. His face was peaceful, almost serene, as he slept, the tension that had been etched into his features finally easing in the quiet of the early morning. Xenia hesitated for a moment, not wanting to disturb his rest, but she knew they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. "Evan," she called softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's time to wake up." Evan stirred, his eyes fluttering open as he slowly came back to consciousness. He blinked a few times, his gaze focusing on Xenia, and then he sat up, rubbing a hand across his face. "Morning already?" he asked, his voice still rough with sleep. Xenia nodded, offering him a small smile. "The storm's passed. We should get moving." Evan stretched, wincing slightly as the stiffness of sleep gave way to the aches and pains of their journey. "Did you get any sleep?" he asked, his tone gentle but concerned. A little. Xenia lied. She didn't want to worry him, didn't want him to know that she had been too anxious to sleep. "I'm fine." Evan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's get packed up and ready to go." They moved quickly, gathering their supplies and checking their gear. The small outpost had served its purpose, providing them with shelter from the storm, but it was time to move on. The message they had sent from the old communications array was still fresh in their minds, a beacon of hope that they couldn't afford to ignore. If help was on the way, they needed to be ready for it, and if it wasn't, they needed to be prepared for the worst. As they packed, Xenia couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The night had passed without incident, but that didn't mean they were safe. The bounty hunters were still out there, somewhere, and she knew they wouldn't stop until they had her in their grasp. The storm had given them a brief reprieve, but now that it was over, the hunt would begin anew. "We need to figure out our next move," Xenia said, as she secured the last of her supplies. "We can't keep running forever. We need to find a way to clear my name, to expose the truth." Evan nodded, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about that. There's something we haven't considered yet, something that might be the key to all of this." Xenia looked at him, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Evan paused, his gaze distant as he gathered his thoughts. "The people who framed you, they went to a lot of trouble to make sure you were silenced. But they also made a mistake. They underestimated you. You've survived everything they've thrown at you, and you've made it this far. That means there's a weakness in their plan, something they overlooked." Xenia considered his words, her mind racing. But how do we find that weakness? How do we expose them? Evan's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "We need to go back to where it all started. We need to find the evidence they buried, the proof that will expose their corruption. If we can get our hands on that, we can turn the tables on them." Xenia felt a spark of hope flare within her, but it was tempered by the reality of the situation. That's easier said than done. The prison was the last place they wanted me to talk. They destroyed everything they could. How can we be sure there's anything left? Evan nodded, understanding the gravity of her concern. "I've been thinking about that too. The people who did this to you, they're powerful, but they're also arrogant. They think they've covered their tracks, but there might be something they missed, something that we can use." He took a deep breath, his expression serious. "There's an old research facility not far from here, buried deep in the mountains. It's been abandoned for years, but it was once a hub for some of the most advanced research in the galaxy. If there's any place where we might find the evidence we need, it's there." Xenia felt a chill run down her spine. But if it's been abandoned, how can we be sure there's anything left? Evan's eyes met hers, his gaze steady. "Because I know the people who worked there. I was one of them." Xenia's breath caught in her throat. "You were?" Evan nodded, his expression grim. "Before I was assigned to Thornus V, I worked at that facility. I was part of a team that was conducting research into new technologies that could have far-reaching implications for both the military and the civilian sectors. But there were things going on there that, well, let's just say they weren't entirely above board. When the project was shut down, a lot of data was buried, hidden away to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. He paused, his gaze distant as he recalled the events of the past. "But I know where some of that data is stored. If we can get to it, we might find something that can help us, something that can prove your innocence and expose the corruption that put you in that prison." Xenia felt a surge of determination, her fear tempered by the possibility of finding the truth. "Then we need to get to that facility. We need to find that data." Evan nodded, his expression resolute. "It won't be easy. The facility is deep in the mountains, and it's been abandoned for years. The security systems might still be active, and there's no telling what condition the data is in. But it's our best shot." Xenia took a deep breath, steeling herself for the journey ahead. "Then let's do it. We've come this far, we can't turn back now." They finished packing in silence, each lost in their own thoughts as they prepared for the journey to the facility. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the task ahead pressing down on them. But there was also a sense of determination, a shared resolve to see this through to the end. Once they were ready, they set out into the morning light, the landscape around them transformed by the recent storm. The ground was soft and muddy underfoot, the air cool and fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and wet vegetation. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks shrouded in mist, the path to the facility winding through treacherous terrain. As they walked, Evan led the way, his knowledge of the area guiding them through the rough landscape. The journey was difficult, the terrain growing steeper and more rugged with each step, but they pressed on, driven by the hope that they were finally on the path to uncovering the truth. The hours passed in a blur of exertion and concentration, their focus entirely on the task at hand. The mountains were a maze of narrow passes and jagged cliffs, the path often obscured by fallen rocks and debris. The air grew thinner as they climbed higher, the temperature dropping as they ventured deeper into the mountains. But despite the challenges, Xenia felt a sense of purpose that kept her going. She had spent so long running, fighting for survival, that the prospect of finally confronting the people who had wronged her filled her with a fierce determination. She was ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead, ready to fight for her freedom and her future. As they neared the facility, the landscape began to change. The rocky terrain gave way to a series of deep gorges and narrow valleys, the ground littered with the remnants of old equipment and machinery. The facility itself was a massive structure, partially buried in the side of the mountain, its walls covered in rust and moss, the windows shattered and dark. Evan led them to a hidden entrance, a small, unmarked door at the base of the facility, concealed by overgrown vegetation. He knelt down and began to work on the lock, his fingers moving quickly and precisely as he bypassed the old security system. After a few moments, the door clicked open, and they stepped inside. The interior of the facility was cold and dark, the air thick with the scent of rust and decay. The walls were lined with old equipment, much of it covered in dust and cobwebs, the floor littered with debris. The lights flickered weakly as they moved through the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Evan led the way, his knowledge of the facility guiding them through the maze of hallways and chambers. Xenia followed closely behind, her senses on high alert, her heart pounding in her chest. The facility felt like a tomb, a place long forgotten by the outside world, and the silence was almost oppressive. They reached a large, reinforced door at the end of a long corridor, its surface pitted and scarred by time. Evan paused, his hand resting on the door, his expression serious. "This is it," he said quietly. "The main data storage room. If there's anything left, it's in here." Xenia nodded, her heart racing with anticipation. "Let's do it." Evan began to work on the door's control panel, his fingers moving quickly as he bypassed the security protocols. The door groaned as it slowly slid open, revealing a large, dimly lit chamber filled with rows of old data terminals and storage units. The air was cool and dry, the walls lined with ancient machinery that hummed softly as it powered up. They stepped inside, their footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. The room was filled with the soft glow of the data terminals, their screens flickering to life as the system came online. Xenia felt a surge of hope as she looked around, her gaze sweeping over the rows of storage units, each one containing the potential to uncover the truth. Evan moved to one of the terminals, his expression focused as he began to access the data. "We need to find the records related to your case," he said, his voice calm but determined. "If there's anything here that can prove your innocence, it's in these files." Xenia joined him at the terminal, her fingers hovering over the controls as she watched the data scroll across the screen. The system was old, the files fragmented and corrupted by years of neglect, but there was still information to be found, still hope that they might uncover something that could help them. As they worked, the tension in the room grew, the weight of their task pressing down on them. The minutes ticked by, each one filled with the soft hum of the machinery and the flickering glow of the screens. Xenia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing as they sifted through the data, searching for anything that might lead them to the truth. Finally, after what felt like hours, Evan let out a sharp breath, his eyes widening as he stared at the screen. "I found something," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "There's a file here encrypted but still accessible. It's marked with the same code as the project you were working on before you were arrested." Xenia's heart leaped in her chest. "Can you open it?" Evan nodded, his fingers flying over the controls as he began to decrypt the file. The screen flickered, the data slowly resolving into a series of documents and logs, each one filled with information that could be the key to clearing Xenia's name. As they read through the files, a picture began to emerge, a picture of a vast, complex conspiracy that reached far beyond the walls of the prison, a web of corruption and deceit that had ensnared not just Xenia, but countless others. The project she had been working on had been a cover for something much darker, an illegal operation to develop weapons and technologies that violated intergalactic treaties, all funded by powerful interests who had no regard for the law. And at the center of it all was Warden Trell, the man who had taken a personal interest in breaking Xenia's spirit, the man who had overseen her imprisonment and who had orchestrated the false charges against her. He had been using the prison as a front for his own operations, silencing anyone who got too close to the truth. Xenia felt a cold fury settle over her as she read the files, the full extent of the conspiracy becoming clear. She had been nothing more than a pawn in their game, a scapegoat to be sacrificed for the sake of their ambitions. But now she had the proof she needed to expose them, to bring the truth to light. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is what we need to clear my name." Evan nodded, his expression grim. "But it's not enough to just have the data. We need to get it out there to make sure it reaches the right people. We need to broadcast it to as many systems as possible so they can't silence it." Xenia's mind raced as she considered their options. "We can use the communications array," she said, her voice firm. "If we can get back to it, we can send the data to every major system in the galaxy. They won't be able to cover it up." Evan nodded, determination glinting in his eyes. "Then we need to move quickly. The longer we stay here, the greater the risk of being discovered." They quickly copied the data onto a secure drive, making sure they had everything they needed before leaving the chamber. The facility was silent as they made their way back to the entrance, the tension in the air almost suffocating. Xenia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind filled with the enormity of what they were about to do. As they stepped outside, the cool mountain air hit them, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the facility. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape, but there was no time to appreciate the beauty of the day. They had a mission, and every second counted. They moved quickly, making their way down the mountain path with as much speed as the rough terrain allowed. The journey back to the communications array was fraught with danger, the threat of discovery hanging over them like a dark cloud. Xenia's senses were on high alert, every rustle of leaves, every shift in the wind sending a jolt of adrenaline through her system. But despite the fear, there was also a sense of hope, a hope that, for the first time, they were on the verge of uncovering the truth, of finally bringing the corrupt forces that had wronged her to justice. As they neared the array, the tension in the air grew, the weight of their task pressing down on them. The structure loomed ahead, a massive silhouette against the sky, its rusted metal framework a stark reminder of the power it once held. They reached the base of the array, the entrance to the control room still open from their previous visit. Evan led the way inside, his expression focused as he moved to the main console, the screens flickering to life as he powered up the system. Xenia stood beside him, her heart racing as she watched the data upload to the terminal. The seconds ticked by, each one filled with a mixture of hope and fear, the anticipation almost unbearable. Finally, the upload was complete, the screen flashing with the confirmation that the data was ready to be transmitted. Evan turned to Xenia, his expression serious. "Are you ready?" Xenia took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she met his eyes. "Let's do it." Evan nodded, his fingers flying over the controls as he initiated the transmission. The data was sent in bursts, each one directed to a different system, ensuring that the truth would reach as many people as possible. As the transmission began, the ground beneath them trembled, a low rumble echoing through the mountains. Xenia's heart skipped a beat, her gaze snapping to the entrance of the control room. "They're here," Evan said, his voice tense. Xenia's mind raced, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. They had come so far, but the danger was far from over. The bounty hunters, the prison authorities, they had found them, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But Xenia wasn't about to give up. She had fought too hard, come too far, to let it end like this. She turned to Evan, her expression resolute. "We need to hold them off until the transmission is complete. We can't let them stop us now." Evan nodded, his expression grim. "I'll stay here and monitor the transmission. You take up a defensive position by the entrance. We can't let them get to the console." Xenia didn't hesitate. She grabbed her weapon and moved to the entrance, her heart pounding as she scanned the landscape outside. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, but the air was thick with tension, the sense of impending danger almost suffocating. She didn't have to wait long. A group of figures emerged from the shadows, their forms obscured by the bright sunlight. Xenia squinted, trying to make out their features, but it was clear who they were: the bounty hunters, sent to track her down and bring her back to the wastes. They moved quickly, their weapons at the ready, their movements precise and calculated. Xenia felt a surge of adrenaline course through her veins as she took aim, her finger hovering over the trigger. The first shot rang out, a sharp crack that echoed through the mountains. Xenia's shot was true, striking one of the bounty hunters in the chest and sending him sprawling to the ground. The others reacted immediately, returning fire with a barrage of energy bolts that forced Xenia to duck behind the entrance for cover. The control room trembled as the firefight intensified, the walls shaking with the force of the blasts. Xenia's heart raced as she returned fire, each shot carefully aimed, each movement calculated to keep the bounty hunters at bay. But they were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Xenia could feel the pressure mounting, the sense of being outnumbered, outgunned. She couldn't hold them off forever. A blast of energy struck the wall beside her, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Xenia ducked, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to regain her bearings. The bounty hunters were closing in, their fire concentrated on her position, and she knew she had to act fast. "Evan," she called out, her voice filled with urgency. "How much longer?" Almost there, Evan shouted back, his voice tight with concentration. "Just a few more seconds." Xenia gritted her teeth, her mind racing as she considered her options. She could hear the bounty hunters' footsteps growing closer, the sound of their weapons charging up for another volley. She had to buy them more time, had to keep them from reaching the control room. Taking a deep breath, Xenia leaned out from behind her cover and fired a rapid series of shots at the approaching bounty hunters. The energy bolts struck their targets, sending 2 more of them to the ground, but the others pressed on, undeterred. The firefight reached a fever pitch, the air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt metal. Xenia's hands trembled as she fired again and again, her movements growing more desperate as the bounty hunters closed in. But just as the situation seemed hopeless, a series of loud beeps echoed through the control room, followed by a deep, resonating hum. "The transmission's complete," Evan shouted, his voice filled with relief. "We did it." Xenia's heart leaped in her chest, a surge of hope washing over her. But the fight wasn't over yet. The bounty hunters were still coming, still determined to stop them. "Fall back to the control room," Xenia called out to Evan, her voice firm. "We need to make our stand here." Evan nodded, quickly gathering their gear and moving to join Xenia at the entrance. The 2 of them took up defensive positions, their weapons trained on the narrow corridor that led into the control room. The bounty hunters were almost upon them, their footsteps echoing through the corridor as they approached. Xenia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind focused entirely on the task at hand. This was the final confrontation, the moment they had been preparing for. As the first of the bounty hunters rounded the corner, Xenia opened fire, her shots precise and deadly. Evan followed suit, his weapon spitting out a rapid series of energy bolts that cut through the narrow corridor like a blade. The bounty hunters fought back with a ferocity that took Xenia's breath away, their movements coordinated and efficient. but she and Evan held their ground, their determination unwavering, as they fought to protect the data they had worked so hard to uncover. The firefight was intense, the air thick with the sound of energy blasts and the smell of burning metal. Senya's arms ached from the effort, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fought to keep the bounty hunters at bay. But despite the overwhelming odds, Senya felt a sense of calm settle over her, a clarity that came from knowing she was fighting for something greater than herself. She was fighting for justice, for the truth, for the chance to clear her name and expose the corruption that had nearly destroyed her. And in that moment she knew she would do whatever it took to see it through. The battle raged on, each second stretching into eternity, the stakes growing higher with every passing moment. But Senya and Evan fought with everything they had, their resolve unshakable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last of the bounty hunters fell, his body crumpling to the ground as the energy bolt struck him square in the chest. The control room fell silent, the air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt metal, the walls scorched and pitted from the intense firefight. Senya lowered her weapon, her body trembling with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked over at Evan, who was leaning against the wall, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and determination. "We did it," Senya said, her voice barely above a whisper. Evan nodded, his expression serious. "We did. But it's not over yet. We need to make sure the data reaches the right people. We need to make sure they can't cover this up." Senya took a deep breath, her mind already racing with the possibilities. "We need to get off this planet. We need to find a ship, something that can get us to the nearest system where we can get the truth out." Evan nodded again, his expression resolute. "Then that's our next move. But first, we need to get out of here. There might be more of them on the way." They quickly gathered their gear, leaving the control room and making their way out of the array. The landscape outside was eerily quiet, the aftermath of the storm leaving behind a world transformed by its fury. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, but the air was thick with tension, the sense of danger still lingering. As they made their way down the mountain path, Senya felt a surge of hope and determination. They had uncovered the truth, exposed the corruption that had nearly destroyed her. But the fight was far from over. They still had to get the data to the right people, still had to make sure that justice was served. But Senya knew deep in her heart that they had taken the first step, a step that would change everything. And as they descended the mountain, the truth in their hands, Senya felt a sense of purpose and resolve that would carry her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The battle was not yet won, but Senya was ready to face whatever came next. She had come too far, fought too hard, to let it end here. The truth was out there, and Senya would see it brought to light no matter the cost. The journey down the mountain was tense and silent, each step taken with the knowledge that their victory was fragile, the danger ever present. The truth was now in their possession, but it was a truth that powerful forces would kill to bury. Senya and Evan were fully aware that their survival depended on getting off Thornus V and delivering the evidence to someone who could ensure it would be acted upon. But first, they had to survive the immediate threats that still lurked in the shadows. The sun hung high in the sky, its unrelenting heat bearing down on them as they picked their way through the rugged terrain. The path was treacherous, littered with rocks and debris from the recent storm, but Senya's determination kept her going. She had come too far to falter now. The air was thick with tension, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. Each breath felt like a countdown to the next inevitable confrontation. Evan led the way, his gaze scanning the landscape for any signs of movement. He was silent, focused, the weight of their mission pressing down on him as heavily as it did on Senya. Every now and then he would glance back at her, offering a small nod of reassurance, but Senya could see the strain etched into his features. They were both exhausted, running on fumes, but they didn't have the luxury of rest. Not now. As they descended into the lower valleys, the oppressive heat of the day began to wane, giving way to the cooler shadows of the late afternoon. The landscape was a patchwork of jagged cliffs and narrow ravines, the ground covered in a thick layer of dust and sand. Thornus V was an unforgiving planet, its beauty marred by the brutality it inflicted on those who dared to traverse its surface. But Senya had learned to respect its harshness, to see the hidden strengths within its barren facade. The same strengths she had found within herself. They had just rounded a bend in the path when Evan suddenly held up a hand, signaling for Xenia to stop. She froze, her heart skipping a beat as she followed his gaze to the ridge above them. There, silhouetted against the setting sun, were figures, dark shapes moving swiftly and silently, their intentions unmistakable. "Bounty hunters," Evan whispered, his voice barely audible. Xenia's pulse quickened, her mind racing as she calculated their next move. There were too many of them to fight head-on, and the terrain offered little in the way of cover. They needed to move quickly, find a way to outmaneuver their pursuers before they were trapped. "We need to get to the canyon," Xenia murmured, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "If we can lose them in the maze of tunnels, we might have a chance." Evan nodded, his expression grim. "Stay close. We have to move fast." Without another word, they took off at a run, their footsteps kicking up dust as they raced down the narrow path. The sound of the bounty hunters pursuing them echoed off the canyon walls, the clatter of their boots growing louder with each passing second. Xenia's heart pounded in her chest, adrenaline surging through her veins as she pushed herself to keep up with Evan's pace. The canyon loomed ahead, its dark entrance a yawning maw that promised both danger and refuge. Xenia could hear the bounty hunters closing in, their voices carrying on the wind, but she forced herself to focus on the path ahead. They were close, so close. But the narrowness of the canyon's entrance would slow down their pursuers, if only for a moment. They reached the mouth of the canyon just as the first shots rang out, the sound of energy weapons slicing through the air. Xenia and Evan dove for cover behind a large boulder, the blast narrowly missing them as they scrambled to catch their breath. The bounty hunters were well-trained, methodical, their shots precise. It was only a matter of time before they were surrounded. "We can't stay here," Xenia gasped, her breath coming in ragged gulps. "They'll pin us down." Evan nodded, his eyes scanning the canyon's interior. The walls were steep, jagged, but there were enough crevices and ledges to provide cover. It was a labyrinth of stone and shadow, a place where they could lose their pursuers if they were careful. "This way," Evan said, motioning for Xenia to follow him. He led her deeper into the canyon, their movements quick and quiet as they weaved between the rocks, always staying one step ahead of the bounty hunters. The sound of the pursuing footsteps grew more distant, the narrowness of the canyon muffling the noise, but Xenia knew they were still being hunted. The canyon twisted and turned, the path growing more treacherous as they ventured deeper into its heart. The walls closed in around them, the light from the setting sun barely penetrating the shadows. Xenia's senses were on high alert, every sound, every movement scrutinized for potential danger. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost suffocating. Evan suddenly stopped, his hand coming up to signal Xenia to halt. She crouched beside him, her breath held as she listened to the soft sounds of footsteps echoing through the canyon. The bounty hunters were close, too close. They couldn't outrun them forever, and Xenia knew they needed a plan, something that would give them an advantage in this deadly game of cat and mouse. Evan's eyes darted around the canyon, taking in the steep walls and the narrow ledges that lined the path. He pointed to a series of small caves that dotted the canyon wall above them. "We can use those," he whispered. "If we can get up there and take out a few of them, we might be able to create enough confusion to slip away." Xenia nodded, understanding the risk but knowing they had no other choice. The caves were narrow, but they would provide cover, and the height advantage would give them a fighting chance. She followed Evan as he climbed up to the nearest cave, her heart pounding in her chest as they moved as quietly as possible. The cave was small, just large enough for them to crouch inside. Xenia pressed her back against the cool stone, her breath steadying as she listened to the sounds of the bounty hunters approaching. Evan positioned himself at the entrance, his weapon ready, his expression grim. "They're almost here," he whispered, his voice tense. "We need to take them by surprise. Aim for the ones in the front, they're the most dangerous." Xenia nodded, her fingers tightening around her weapon. She had faced danger before, but this was different. This was a fight for survival, a battle against forces that would stop at nothing to see her silenced. But she was ready. She had to be. The bounty hunters rounded the bend in the canyon, their movements cautious as they searched for their quarry. Xenia could see the determination in their eyes, the cold efficiency of their training. They were professionals, and they were here to finish the job. Evan didn't hesitate. He opened fire, his shots precise and deadly, taking out the lead bounty hunter before the others could react. Xenia followed suit, her weapon spitting out a rapid series of energy bolts that struck two more of the hunters, sending them sprawling to the ground. The remaining bounty hunters scattered, taking cover behind the rocks as they returned fire. The canyon erupted in a hail of energy blasts, the air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt metal. Xenia and Evan held their ground, their shots deliberate, each one aimed to keep the bounty hunters pinned down. But the hunters were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Xenia could feel the pressure mounting, the sense of being outgunned, outmatched. The cave offered little protection, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they were overrun. "Evan," she called out, her voice tight with fear. "We can't hold them off forever." Evan nodded, his expression grim. "We need to keep moving. There's a path that leads out of the canyon up ahead. If we can reach it, we might be able to lose them." Xenia didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled out of the cave, her heart pounding as she followed Evan deeper into the canyon. The path was narrow and treacherous, the ground uneven and slick with loose stones, but they pushed on, driven by the knowledge that their only chance of survival lay in staying ahead of their pursuers. The bounty hunters were close on their heels, their footsteps echoing off the canyon walls as they gave chase. Xenia's breath came in ragged gasps, her legs burning with the effort of keeping up with Evan's pace. The canyon twisted and turned, the path growing more precarious with each step, but she forced herself to keep moving, to push through the pain and exhaustion. Finally, they reached the end of the canyon, the path opening up into a wide, rocky plateau. The ground was uneven, covered in jagged rocks and boulders, but it offered a clear view of the surrounding landscape and, more importantly, a way out. There Evan pointed to a narrow pass on the far side of the plateau. "If we can make it through there, we'll be out of the canyon. They won't be able to follow us as easily." Xenia nodded, her heart racing with anticipation. But just as they started to move toward the pass, a shadow fell over them, a dark figure emerging from behind the rocks. It was Warden Trell. He stood there, his massive form blocking their path, his eyes cold and calculating as they locked onto Xenia. His battle-scarred exosuit hummed with power, the metal plates gleaming in the fading light. He was a menacing figure, a reminder of everything Xenia had fought to escape. Going somewhere, Trell's voice was a low, menacing growl, reverberating through the canyon. Xenia froze, her blood running cold, as she stared at the man who had been the architect of her suffering. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the world narrowing down to the two of them, Xenia and the Warden, predator and prey. But Xenia was no longer the frightened prisoner she had once been. She had survived the wastes, crossed the desert, uncovered the truth. She had found strength in herself that she hadn't known existed, and she was ready to face Trell, to confront the man who had tried to break her. "We're leaving," Trell, Xenia said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "You won't stop us." Trell's eyes narrowed, a cruel smile curling at the corners of his lips. "You think you've won? That you can just walk away?" He took a step forward, the ground trembling under the weight of his exosuit. "You're nothing, Xenia. A pawn, a tool. You were meant to be forgotten." Xenia tightened her grip on her weapon, her gaze never leaving Trell's. "You underestimated me," she replied, her voice firm. "You underestimated the people you thought you could control. The truth is out there now, Trell. It's over." Trell's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You think you've won?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "I can still end this, right here, right now." With a sudden, fluid motion, Trell raised his arm, the weapon mounted on his exosuit charging with a high-pitched whine. Xenia's heart skipped a beat, her instincts screaming at her to move, to get out of the way. But before Trell could fire, Evan stepped forward, placing himself between Xenia and the Warden. "Get out of the way," Carter Trell growled, his weapon trained on Evan's chest. "This doesn't concern you." Evan's expression was calm, resolute. "It concerns me more than you know, Trell. I won't let you hurt her." Trell sneered, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "You're a fool, Carter. A traitor to your kind. Do you really think you can stop me?" Evan didn't flinch, his gaze steady as he faced down the Warden. "Maybe not. But I'm willing to try." Xenia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing as she watched the standoff unfold. She couldn't let Evan sacrifice himself, couldn't let Trell win. She had come too far, fought too hard, to let it end like this. Before she could react, Trell's weapon discharged, a bright, searing beam of energy shooting toward Evan. But in that split second, Evan moved, diving to the side and rolling behind a large boulder. The beam struck the ground where he had stood, sending up a shower of sparks and molten rock. Xenia didn't hesitate. She raised her weapon and fired, the energy bolt striking Trell's exosuit with a loud clang. The warden staggered back, momentarily thrown off balance, but his suit's armor absorbed most of the impact. Trell snarled, his gaze locking onto Xenia. "You think you can beat me?" he spat, his voice filled with rage. "You're nothing. Just another criminal, another expendable." But Xenia didn't let his words shake her. She fired again, aiming for the exposed joints in Trell's armor, the weak spots she had noticed during their previous encounters. Her shots were precise, calculated, each one aimed to disable, not kill. Trell roared in anger, his exosuit sparking as the energy bolts found their mark. He charged forward, his massive form barreling toward Xenia with terrifying speed. But Xenia was ready. She ducked to the side, narrowly avoiding Trell's attack, and fired another volley at his back. The shot struck true, hitting the power core of Trell's exosuit. There was a loud crack, followed by a series of sparks and smoke as the exosuit's systems began to fail. Trell stumbled, his movements becoming sluggish as the power drained from his suit. Xenia seized the opportunity. She moved quickly, closing the distance between them and delivering a powerful kick to Trell's chest. The force of the blow sent him crashing to the ground, his exosuit malfunctioning, its power core sparking wildly. Trell struggled to rise, his expression twisted with rage and disbelief. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "I'll hunt you down, I'll tell." But Xenia cut him off, her weapon trained on his head. "It is over, Trell," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "You've lost." For a moment, the two of them locked eyes, the tension between them palpable. Trell's gaze was filled with hatred, but there was also a flicker of something else: fear. He had underestimated Xenia, underestimated her determination, her strength. And now he was paying the price. "Don't do it." Xenia Evans' voice came from behind her, gentle but firm. "He's not worth it." Xenia hesitated, her finger hovering over the trigger. She had every reason to pull it, every reason to end the threat that Trell posed to her and countless others. But Evan's words resonated with her, cutting through the anger and fear that had driven her for so long. Slowly, Xenia lowered her weapon, her gaze never leaving Trell's. "You're right," she said quietly. "He's not worth it." Trell sneered, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. "You're weak," he spat. "You'll regret this." Xenia shook her head, her expression calm. "No, Trell. You're the one who'll regret it." She turned away from him, her heart pounding in her chest as she walked back to Evan. The weight of the confrontation was heavy on her shoulders, but she knew she had made the right choice. She wasn't like Trell, she wasn't a monster. Evan met her gaze, his expression filled with admiration and relief. "You did the right thing," he said softly. "He's finished. He knows it." Xenia nodded, her breath coming in steady but deep gulps as she tried to calm her racing heart. "We need to get out of here. There might be more of them." Evan agreed, and together they moved quickly toward the narrow pass that led out of the plateau. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, but Xenia felt a sense of hope, of purpose, that she hadn't felt in a long time. They had won, but the fight was far from over. They still needed to get off Thornus V, still needed to ensure that the truth they had uncovered reached the right people. But Xenia knew, deep in her heart, that they had taken the first step towards something greater. As they descended the mountain, the night closing in around them, Xenia felt a sense of determination settle over her. She had faced the darkness, faced the man who had tried to break her, and she had emerged stronger, more resolute than ever. The journey ahead would be difficult, the challenges many, but Xenia was ready. She had come too far, fought too hard, to let it end here. The truth was out there, and Xenia would see it brought to light no matter the cost. And as they disappeared into the shadows, the stars beginning to twinkle in the night sky, Xenia knew that this was only the beginning. The final confrontation was over, but the battle for justice had just begun. The night air was cool and crisp as Xenia and Evan made their way through the winding paths that cut through the desolate landscape of Thornus V. The stars above twinkled faintly in the dark sky, their light barely penetrating the thick atmosphere that clung to the planet like a shroud. The shadows of the mountains loomed large around them, and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional whisper of the wind. The adrenaline from the battle with Warden Trell had faded, leaving a heavy exhaustion in its wake, but neither of them could afford to rest yet. They had to reach safety, and they had to do it quickly. They had left Trell's broken form behind in the canyon, his threats still echoing in Xenia's mind as they hurried away from the site of their final confrontation. She knew that Trell's influence didn't end with his defeat. There were others powerful people who would do anything to protect the secrets that Xenia and Evan now held in their hands. The data they had transmitted from the communications array was their only weapon, but it was also a beacon that could draw unwanted attention. Every moment they stayed on Thornus V was a moment closer to being captured or killed. The rugged terrain made their progress slow, but Xenia's resolve pushed her forward. They needed to find a way off the planet, and they needed to do it soon. The bounty hunters had been relentless, and there was no doubt that more would come once word of Trell's failure spread. Xenia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that danger lurked just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. She kept her weapon close, her senses on high alert as they navigated the treacherous landscape. Evan walked beside her, his expression tense but focused. He had been a steady presence throughout their journey, a constant source of support and strength. But Xenia could see the strain in his eyes, the weight of their situation pressing down on him, just as heavily as it did on her. They had been through so much together, and now they were closer than ever to exposing the truth, but the path ahead was still fraught with danger. "We need to find a way to contact someone off-world," Evan said quietly, breaking the silence. "The message we sent might have reached someone, but we can't rely on that alone. We need to find a ship, something that can get us to a more populated system where we can get the evidence into the right hands." Xenia nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. "There's a small spaceport not far from here," she replied. "It's mostly used by scavengers and traders, but it should have what we need. If we can get there without being spotted, we might be able to find a ship and get off this rock." Evan's gaze was thoughtful, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's risky, but it's our best shot. We need to move quickly before anyone realizes we're heading there." With their course set, they picked up the pace, their footsteps echoing through the narrow ravines and craggy hillsides. The spaceport was a few hours' trek away, nestled in a valley that was often shrouded in mist, making it difficult to spot from above. It was the perfect place to lay low and secure passage off-world, but it was also a place where danger could lurk around every corner. The journey was arduous, the rough terrain and their fatigue slowing them down, but Xenia and Evan pressed on, driven by the urgency of their mission. The path grew narrower as they approached the valley, the walls of rock closing in around them, and the air grew cooler, the temperature dropping as the night deepened. The stars above seemed to watch them with a distant, indifferent gaze, their cold light casting long shadows on the ground. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the edge of the valley. The spaceport lay below them, a small cluster of buildings and landing pads surrounded by a high fence. The mist that clung to the ground gave the place an eerie, ghostly appearance, but Xenia could see the faint glow of lights through the haze, a sign that the port was still active, despite the late hour. They crouched behind a rocky outcrop, surveying the area before making their move. The spaceport was quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of machinery and the occasional clang of metal. There were a few ships docked on the landing pads, their silhouettes barely visible through the mist. Xenia's heart raced as she scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement, any indication that they had been spotted. "We need to be careful," Evan whispered, his voice barely audible. "If anyone sees us, they'll report it to the authorities. We need to find a ship and get out of here before that happens." Xenia nodded, her gaze fixed on one of the smaller ships docked near the edge of the port. It was an older model, a freighter that had seen better days, but it looked serviceable enough to get them off the planet. The ship's lights were dim, and there was no sign of activity around it, a good sign that it was either unoccupied or lightly guarded. "That one," Xenia said, pointing to the freighter. "It looks like our best bet. We can sneak aboard and get out before anyone knows we were here." Evan followed her gaze, nodding in agreement. "Let's do it." They moved cautiously down the slope, keeping to the shadows as they made their way toward the ship. The ground was uneven, the rocks loose underfoot, but Xenia's training and experience kept her steady. Every sense was on high alert, every muscle tensed for action. The mist swirled around them, obscuring their movements and adding to the tension. As they neared the ship, Xenia could see that the landing ramp was down, a soft glow emanating from within the cargo hold. She exchanged a glance with Evan, who nodded, his expression serious. They would have to move quickly and quietly, avoiding any crew members who might be inside. It was a risky plan, but they had no other choice. With one last look around to ensure they hadn't been spotted, Xenia and Evan slipped inside the ship, the misty air giving way to the warmer, slightly stale atmosphere of the freighter's interior. The cargo hold was dimly lit, filled with crates and containers stacked haphazardly along the walls. The hum of the ship's engines was a low, steady drone, a sign that it was ready for departure. Xenia motioned for Evan to follow her as she made her way deeper into the ship, her footsteps light and deliberate. They needed to find the bridge, take control of the ship, and plot a course out of the system. Every second counted, and Xenia's heart raced with the knowledge that they were so close to escape. They moved quickly through the narrow corridors, the walls lined with old, worn panels and flickering lights. The freighter was clearly a working vessel, functional but far from luxurious. Xenia's mind was focused, her thoughts running through the steps they would need to take to get the ship airborne and off-planet. She was confident in her abilities, but she knew that any mistake could be their last. As they approached the bridge, Xenia slowed, listening for any signs of activity. The door to the bridge was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out into the corridor. She could hear the soft murmur of voices, the sound of someone typing at a console. It wasn't what she had hoped for, but it wasn't an insurmountable problem either. Evan leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll take out the pilot. You cover me." Xenia nodded, her grip tightening on her weapon as she positioned herself at the side of the door. Evan moved quickly and silently, slipping through the gap in the door and into the bridge. Xenia held her breath, listening intently for any signs of a struggle. A muffled thud followed by a grunt of pain was all she heard before Evan reappeared, motioning for her to enter. She stepped onto the bridge, her eyes quickly adjusting to the dim light. The pilot was slumped over in his seat, unconscious, a small bruise forming on his temple where Evan had struck him. The bridge was empty otherwise, the controls still active, the ship ready for launch. "We're clear," Evan said, moving to the main console. "Let's get this ship off the ground." Xenia took the co-pilot's seat, her fingers flying over the controls as she powered up the ship's engines and prepared for takeoff. The freighter's systems responded sluggishly, a testament to its age, but it was nothing Xenia couldn't handle. She set the coordinates for the nearest jump point, her heart pounding with anticipation. Evan worked beside her, his focus entirely on getting them out of the atmosphere and into space. The ship's thrusters roared to life, the freighter shuddering as it lifted off the ground and began its ascent. The lights of the spaceport grew smaller as they rose, the mist parting to reveal the stars above. But just as Xenia was beginning to feel a sense of relief, the ship's sensors blared a warning, a proximity alert, something incoming. Her heart sank as she glanced at the sensor display. A ship was closing in fast, and it was armed. "Bounty hunters," Evan muttered, his voice filled with frustration. "They must have tracked us to the spaceport." Xenia's mind raced as she considered their options. The freighter was slow, its weapons systems outdated at best. They couldn't outrun the bounty hunters, and a head-to-head confrontation would be suicide. They needed to think fast. "We can't fight them," Xenia said, her voice tense. "But we might be able to lose them in the asteroid field near the jump point. It's risky, but it's our only chance." Evan didn't hesitate. "Do it." Xenia adjusted their course, pushing the freighter's engines to their limits as they veered toward the asteroid field. The ship shuddered under the strain, the hull groaning as the gravity of Thornus V began to loosen its grip. The proximity alert continued to blare, the bounty hunter's ship closing in with alarming speed. The asteroid field was a dense cluster of rocks and debris orbiting Thornus V, a treacherous obstacle course that few pilots dared to navigate. But Xenia knew it was their only hope. If they could lose the bounty hunters in the field, they might have a chance to reach the jump point and escape. The freighter plunged into the asteroid field, the ship's shields flaring as they deflected smaller rocks and debris. Xenia's hands were steady on the controls, her eyes fixed on the path ahead as she maneuvered the ship through the maze of asteroids. The bounty hunters followed, their ship nimble and fast, but Xenia's knowledge of the terrain gave her an edge. The ship twisted and turned, narrowly avoiding collisions with massive chunks of rock that floated lazily through space. The sensors were going haywire, the proximity alerts overlapping as the asteroids closed in around them. Xenia's breath came in shallow gasps, her focus razor-sharp as she guided the freighter through the field. A bright flash of light filled the cockpit as one of the bounty hunters' shots struck a nearby asteroid, sending a shower of debris hurtling toward them. Xenia banked hard to the left, the ship groaning in protest as it narrowly avoided the incoming barrage. But the maneuver had cost them speed, and the bounty hunters were closing the gap. Evan worked furiously at the console, rerouting power to the engines and shields, trying to eke out every bit of speed the freighter had to offer. But Xenia could see the strain on his face, the knowledge that they were running out of options. "We're not going to make it," Evan said, his voice filled with frustration. "They're too fast." Xenia's mind raced, searching for a solution. They were so close, but the bounty hunters were relentless, their ship more agile, more heavily armed. They needed to shake them off, create an opening that would allow them to reach the jump point. Then, an idea struck her. "There's a large asteroid ahead," Xenia said, her voice filled with urgency. "If we can time it right, we can use it to block their line of sight, just long enough for us to break away." Evan's eyes widened as he saw the asteroid she was talking about, a massive chunk of rock, easily 3 times the size of their ship, slowly rotating in space. "It's risky," he said, his voice filled with doubt. "If we miscalculate." "We won't," Xenia interrupted, her voice firm. "We can do this." Evan hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "All right, let's do it." Xenia adjusted their course, aiming for the asteroid's shadow. The ship's engines roared as she pushed them to their limits, the freighter shuddering as it surged forward. The bounty hunters followed, their shots growing more desperate as they realized what Xenia was trying to do. The asteroid loomed larger in the cockpit's viewports, its rough, pitted surface filling their vision. Xenia's hands were steady on the controls, her mind focused entirely on the timing. They needed to be precise too soon, and the bounty hunters would see their maneuver too late, and they'd crash into the asteroid. Now, Xenia shouted, pulling the controls hard to the right. The freighter banked sharply, diving into the asteroid's shadow just as the bounty hunter's ship closed in. The massive rock blocked their line of sight, momentarily obscuring the freighter from view. Xenia held her breath, her eyes fixed on the sensor display as she watched the bounty hunter's ship hesitate, confused by the sudden disappearance of their target. It was all the opening they needed. Xenia fired the thrusters, the freighter surging out from behind the asteroid and away from the pursuing ship. The bounty hunters were caught off guard, their ship scrambling to adjust its course, but it was too late. The freighter had broken free, putting enough distance between them and their pursuers to reach the jump point. Evan quickly entered the coordinates for the jump, his hands moving with practiced precision as he activated the ship's hyperdrive. The stars outside the cockpit blurred, stretching into long streaks of light as the ship made the jump to hyperspace. For a moment the cockpit was filled with the hum of the hyperdrive, the tension in the air palpable. Then, with a final lurch, the ship exited hyperspace, the stars returning to their normal, distant points of light. They had made it. Xenia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hands trembling slightly as she released the controls. The adrenaline that had fueled her throughout the chase was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. "We did it," Evan said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We actually did it." Xenia nodded, her mind still reeling from the intensity of the chase. But even as the relief washed over her, she knew their journey was far from over. They had escaped Thornus V, but now they needed to find a safe haven, a place where they could deliver the evidence and ensure that the truth was brought to light. "Where do we go from here?" Xenia asked, her voice quiet but steady. Evan's gaze was thoughtful, his expression serious. "We need to find someone we can trust, someone with the resources and influence to make sure this information reaches the right people. There's a planet in the nearby system, a hub of trade and communication. We can start there, see if we can make contact with someone who can help us." Xenia nodded, her resolve firming. "Then that's where we'll go. We've come this far, we can't stop now." Evan set the coordinates, the ship's engines humming softly as they prepared for the next jump. Xenia leaned back in her seat, her mind racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. They had faced countless dangers, overcome impossible odds, but the fight for justice was far from over. As the stars blurred once more, the ship jumping to hyperspace, Xenia allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had been through so much, had fought so hard to uncover the truth, and now she was closer than ever to seeing justice served. But she knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges she couldn't yet foresee. But Xenia was ready. She had found strength within herself that she hadn't known existed, and she had found an ally in Evan, someone who believed in her and was willing to fight by her side. The stars stretched out before them, a vast expanse of possibilities and dangers, but Xenia knew that she would face whatever came next with courage and determination. The fight for justice was just beginning, and Xenia was ready to see it through to the end. The future was uncertain, the path ahead filled with obstacles, but Xenia knew one thing for certain. She would not stop until the truth was brought to light, no matter the cost. And as they hurtled through the stars, leaving Thornus V far behind, Xenia felt a renewed sense of purpose, a sense that, no matter what lay ahead, she would continue to fight for justice, for herself, and for all those who had been wronged. The journey was far from over, but Xenia was ready to face whatever challenges awaited her. She was no longer a victim, she was a warrior, a survivor, and she would see justice done.